All right, everybody. Hello and welcome. This is the Daily Discussion. As you can see right now, I am outside. That's where I love to be the most. And I have a special guest on. His name is Marin. We're going to talk a little bit about evolutionary psychology. But before we get into that, I do just want to ask, how did you get into this field? How did you become interested in this particular subject?
Well, originally I studied medicine. However, I got curious why. So I went into medicine for several reasons. Obviously, I was interested in how the body works, wanted to help people, whatever. However, I had high expectations in terms of what people I was going to meet, what doctors should be like. Those were my childhood foolish assumptions. And I kind of noticed that people acted irrationally regardless of profession or field or whatever. And then I started researching, why do we act the way we do? And there are a lot of theories in human psychology. And however, evolutionary psychology proved to be first the most interesting to me. And second, it kind of offered falsifiable theories of human behavior. So it could predict human behavior in a way which no other theory currently in psychology can. So yeah, that got me hooked up on evolutionary psychology.
So one argument that I see coming to the surface in the modern time is the idea that we're fully transparent to ourselves. And it just seems to me like if we were fully transparent to ourselves, we wouldn't need things like psychology or anthropology and philosophy and all these studies. What do you think about that idea? What do you say to somebody who thinks that we don't need psychology at an individual level?
Can you just elaborate what exactly you mean by fully transparent to ourselves?
So, I just feel like we wouldn't need something like philosophy and psychology if we had a full understanding of our behavior and our innate tendencies. What would you say to somebody if they said that we don't need psychology because we already at an individual level can understand ourselves fully?
Well, that contradicts with the empirical reality.
Right.
Actually, what we see is that people are really easy to fool, and it's easiest to fool yourself. And we know that, but it's difficult to motivate yourself to wash the dishes. Needless to say about other things.
Yeah, well, Tony Robbins has a philosophy where he kind of says that you shouldn't negotiate with yourself when it comes to doing a difficult task. One thing that I've found in my experience is that whenever I want to convince myself to do something, there's always that initial resistance. But if I can just get over that initial resistance, I can actually push myself to do something that I don't want to do. But then I always feel better afterwards. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. Victory over self.
Definitely. So one other question I had for you. What is the key distinction between regular psychology and evolutionary psychology?
I'm not sure whether we have the term regular psychology, because if you check the American Psychological Association website, you will see a lot of subdivisions in psychology.
Right. There's psychoanalytic psychology, cognitive psychology, positive psychology, all that stuff.
Yeah, experimental psychology, evolutionary psychology, sports psychology, educational psychology. Yeah.
So I guess my question is more along the lines of what is it that makes evolutionary psychology different from the rest?
Yeah. So, okay, let's go back to the basic principles. You study something scientifically. So you can study rocks, you can study birds, or you can study human behavior. And the way you approach this is to gather observations from the external environment, so gather data. Let's say that you're studying the contents of boxes. So inside the box, you may have either a red ball or a green ball. So that's a pretty abstract example, just to illustrate the point. And so you first start by opening the boxes and you check, in this box you have a green ball, in this box you have a red ball, whatever. And all these observations are useful, but when you gather too many of them, then you don't know how to interpret that data. and you need a theory to organize all that data. And a good theory needs to be predictive. So a good theory should tell you with a certain degree of probability what you should find in a certain box, following a simple rule. And if the theory isn't predictive, then you don't have a good theory, actually, that explains why things are the way they are. In psychology, a lot of the theories in psychology before the advent of evolutionary psychology were pretty descriptive, and they made a really bad, they couldn't actually predict human behavior. They tend to explain human behavior after the fact. So everything is obvious after the fact, you know. They couldn't predict what would happen. I can give you an example, and an example I call the bad case of psychoanalysis. You have a person. Let's analyze one sentence about someone's behavior.
Right.
He opened the door. Mm-hmm. That's the sentence. That's the behavior. Now let's analyze that. That's the observation. First theory. He opened the door because he is really brave and he isn't afraid to explore new horizons. Logical, right? You know, sounds pretty logical. Second theory. He opened the door because he is afraid and he can't handle his current situation, so he runs away from his problems.
Right.
Sound logical, right? So both of these sound logical. And so you can't say which is correct.
Right. So you would need a theory to kind of indicate which one is the more likely option.
Correct. So you need a theory that can tell you whether the man in the current example, the person is brave or not, but you should be able to tell that prior to his behavioral response. To give another interesting example, there is a study done some decades ago. People were divided in two groups, and they were asked, who makes better soldiers? Men from large cities or men from small rural towns? And you know, people had their theories who make better soldiers, and then the participants were given the answer. Half of the people were told that men from large cities make better soldiers. Half of the people were told that men from small rural towns make better soldiers. And then people started explaining why this is the case. So the first group said, well, that's obvious. Men from large cities, they are more modern men, whatever. So they figure out cases why men from larger cities made better soldiers. And the second group explained that men from small rural towns, it's obvious that this is the case because they are physically fit, stronger, have a stronger sense of community, whatever. So as you see, we have this innate ability to rationalize and explain any behavior after we know what happened. But we don't have a good theory that will tell us what will happen.
So are you familiar with integral theory?
Yes, Ken Wilber.
Is that kind of what, yeah, exactly. So I was actually just having a conversation with my friend about integral theory, and it kind of sounds like that's a little bit what you're touching on, is the idea that we need to have we need to create correlations between separate theories in order to have an accurate map of the world.
Oh, most definitely. That's, at least for me, the most fun intellectual thing that you can do.
Right, is try to make connections between two things that don't seemingly have a connection.
Yeah, so in the 20th century, knowledge advanced like in this axis. Each discipline was drilling deeper and deeper, and now we need to connect the different disciplines together.
Did they ever find out which produced the best soldiers, the big cities or the small town? I'm kind of curious.
I don't remember actually.
Oh, it'd be interesting to look up for sure.
I think it was the men from the big cities, but that just, it's pretty vague in my mind. No.
Now, one thing too is, do you feel like your history with medicine kind of helped navigate you to this field, or do you feel like it sometimes has utility in helping you decipher certain things?
Oh, it helped me learn how to acquire huge volumes of information for the
Right.
smallest possible amount of time. That definitely helped.
So you're not going to become a doctor or anything in the future. You kind of your interests have kind of swayed away from that a little bit, right?
Yeah, I graduated and I had this passion for science since childhood. Classical passion for science.
So if you don't mind me asking, what's your plan? What do you want to do with that?
I can tell you, yeah.
Yeah.
I went into research instead of going into clinical practice.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't work with patients anymore. Currently, I'm teaching anatomy and cell biology to medical students and doing a PhD in neuroscience. So I should finish that in a couple of months, hopefully, if everything runs smoothly. So I'm actually interested in learning a huge set of disciplines, beginning from evolution to the origin of life, to human evolutionary psychology, economics, political science. I really want to understand human behavior on all these dimensions. And that takes time, and I'm looking for ways to be able to do that on a full-time basis. In academia, you need to specialize really in one single thing.
Right. Well, I feel like one of the really effective ways of doing that is kind of having conversations like these. I almost feel like one of the best ways to solidify information in your mind is to talk about it. So that's actually why I started the podcast, is because I wanted to bring in people who know a lot more than I do so I can learn. And, even just having this conversation with you, I feel like I'm already learning a lot. One thing I wanted to bring up for you, and it's on my notes here, is I've been thinking a lot about whether or not human beings are more likely to think before they act or act before they think. Now, I think it's very clear to me that we act before we think, especially when we're emotional. Is there any evidence within the field that you're working in that can support that idea?
Well, I can tell you what I know in terms of studies. However, right, I haven't checked the newest study, so what I'm telling you may be outdated, so
that's okay.
That's the half-life of scientific knowledge is pretty
right.
small.
It's almost like by your fourth year of college, everything you learned in the first year is outdated. It's exponential.
Yeah, the worst thing is that like a week before your exam, the standard drugs for a certain disease change, and you need to relearn that all over again. Never mind. So there are studies showing that the brain makes a decision up to several seconds before we are aware that we've made that decision.
Mm-hmm.
And then we rationalize backwards, similar to what we've been discussing until now. Mm-hmm. Then we'll rationalize why we made that decision. And that's actually not good, because you believe that you thought beforehand, you thought really through that to reach your decision, but actually your brain was already calculating. Yeah.
And I think that's especially true when you're emotional, right? Is you kind of just act and you don't really think about what you're doing until after you've done it,
That sounds like standard human behavior.
Right, exactly. I mean, it just seems so obvious, but I think before they kind of had this notion, people really were in love with the idea that they thought before they acted. It just doesn't seem to me to have any utility to think that way.
There is utility, by the way. I've thought about that. Why is this the case? If most of us, all of us actually, mm-hmm. Are deceiving ourselves, that means that that should have given us a survival advantage during our evolution. Now, I will give an example. Good. So a lot of recent findings show that certain important behavioral traits are mostly determined by your genes and far less than the behavior of your parents. Mm-hmm. So it isn't so important how you raise your children in terms of specific, not everything, in terms of specific traits which they may possess. Now, Let's imagine that we have two people, two parents. The first one knows the truth. Most of my actions won't have any strong impact on the behavior of my child. So the success of my child won't succeed that strongly by my behavior. The second person will believe 100% of my actions will be important for the future of my child. So that person may say genetics is BS. Everything depends upon me. If you have the will, you will succeed. That kind of wrong things. But if you believe that, check out what happens. The second person, although they are empirically wrong, they will have the motivation to put in more effort into raising their children than the person that knows the truth. So in the end, the small percentage of your child's future success that depends upon your behavior, the second person will maximize that. So
it's almost like it's difficult to differentiate what's true from what's useful.
Yeah, the truth may not always be useful. That's a key insight I had.
A good example of that is it's a funny little anecdote, but it's if you were being created and you kind of had a say in how you would be constructed, would you rather be a truthful person but everybody thought you were a liar, or would you rather be a liar but everyone thought you were truthful? It's like obviously you'd rather be the liar that everyone thinks it's truthful because there's utility in that kind of social bonding. You know what I mean?
I can't answer that question. It's far too deep.
Oh, it's a deep question. It's hard. It's actually, I was reading The Righteous Man, why good people get hostile over disagreements in politics and religion. Are you familiar with Jonathan Haidt and some of his work?
Yes.
Yeah, he does a lot of that kind of stuff. Actually, one really good book I read by Jonathan Haidt was The Coddling of the American Mind. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I am not familiar with the work in the depth I would wish to, though.
Well, that's kind of what I wanted to ask you. And I really like having people on the podcast who are from different countries. Speaking of which, what city are you in right now?
I am in Varna, Bulgaria.
Do you guys have a problem with coddling your young minds?
Haven't seen that, by the way. So maybe that's coming here. As we say here, we are 30 years behind the world. So maybe that will come in a decade or so.
What is the socio-economic and political landscape of your country looking like right now?
The country is in Eastern Europe, and that speaks a lot for itself.
Right.
So what can I tell you? There are some positive sides and some downsides. So it's pretty different. Than in the West, both culturally and economically. There is a big gap between the successful and non-successful people. So a huge, enormous gap. So you're either really poor or really rich. So there's
no middle.
No, literally. So even the the products and services which are offered, you can sense that. Services are cheap, though. That's the thing. It's cheap. Costs of living pretty cheap. Services are pretty cheap. It's a Western style culture to an extent, so you won't have a culture shock if you come here to visit us.
Do you guys have freedom of speech over there?
Okay, that's interesting. This is a main reason why I decided to stay here. Like a lot of my colleagues, which, they graduated and immediately went abroad because of the freedom of speech. Of course, okay, if you don't speak against the mafia, you won't have that many problems. That's the first thing. Also, we tend to value classic macho style behavior here. I call it we're in the wild east,
That's funny. Maybe we'll make some movies about it.
Yeah, definitely. And so I have students from the West. So the Medical University of Varna is pretty international. So we have students from all over the world. And some of my students say jokingly that if I go and teach in their countries, I would go to jail within a week. And I'm not doing anything obnoxious, you know, I'm
Right.
speaking normally. So that's
Well,
difficult to swallow.
that's kind of what the book that I was referencing kind of talks about, is how in America, it seems as if we teach young kids that the path to wisdom is to avoid uncomfortable conversations. And I think that America has a certain level of intellect, but we lack maturity in that we can't really have real conversations, especially if it, you know, if it damages someone's feelings. You know, it's almost as if we live in a time in America where our feelings supersede the objective reality.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. And that leads to a certain state of immaturity on the population level. You know, you need adversity to grow.
How do you think you can solve that at a psychological level?
I'm pretty cautious when I should discuss prescription level ideas.
Right. Best guess?
I would avoid actually say, I can tell you several hypotheses. So now I'm thinking like a doctor. You list several things, check them out. Probably this has been studied. So the first thing is to Google what has been studied. But it isn't obvious what the useful level of, first, what do we mean by adversity? Then what is the useful level of adversity? How do you define useful adversity? How do you measure that? How do you track that? But let's say that freedom of speech is a certain necessity.
Right.
If the only thing that can get hurt is someone's feelings, you're doing the person a disservice, you know?
Right.
You're avoiding opportunities for growth. No, I really can't tell you what we should do there. It's
well, if I kind of like what you just said there, because it's almost like if someone was hurting themselves and they didn't know it, you wouldn't be helping them by not telling them. You'd actually be hurting them even further by letting them continue the behavior. So actually, it seems to me that the way we solve this problem is to just force ourselves to have the conversation, even if we don't want to have it.
The problem here is that if we think in extremes, now we have one extreme, you don't discuss any issues, not to offend anyone, not to hurt any feelings.
Right.
And then that builds up, you know, people build up with resentment, people become resentful, and then the other extreme would be be brutally direct, which is maladaptive as well, you know. So
right. Well, isn't that like the first thing you learn when you get into psychology, is that if you repress something, it comes back with a vengeance?
Probably that's the case. Maybe the middle ground would be to have free, open discussions which are kind in their intent. So being direct doesn't mean that you should be, you shouldn't be kind.
Well, that's another issue that I see in my own country, is people lack the ability to agree to disagree, which I think there's so much virtue in being able to do that properly.
I thought a lot about why do we fight over ideas so much.
Right.
A lot of the insights came from Jordan Peterson's work. And when you link that with evolutionary psychology, you get some pretty interesting hypotheses which can be tested. Now, let's reduce humanity to a single tribe of 150 individuals. Now, the average to maximum size of human tribes before. And during a lot of our evolutionary history, we had no idea that other tribes existed.
Right.
So that's interesting. Good. So the whole of humanity, around 100 people, and we all know each other. There is a key important thing which we need to succeed, to have the same values and to have the same behavioral strategies how we do things. I will give you an example. Every single human behavior 100,000 years ago was a matter of life and death. even going to the bushes, to urinate was dangerous. There were a lot of things which were wanting to bite you and whatever. So people discovered what works the hard way. A lot of people died, a lot of people got injured. And what works was passed down the generations.
Right.
And at a certain point, your known strategy to do something may not be the best one, but the risk of trying a better one may not be worth it. So you stick to the good old tested imperfect strategy. And when someone tries to deviate from that accepted behavior, then you may risk the survival of the whole group. Imagine that you're the key hunter.
Right.
And everybody's nourishment for that week depends on you, and you want to try something new. You may endanger everybody, so you will get punished for that.
Well, you talked about Jordan Peterson, and he actually touches on that in another way, where he kind of breaks down and says, there's almost no change that you can implement on a complex system without making it worse. Even if it's well-intentioned, the road to hell is paved with good intention. It's kind of something along those lines.
And our systems are more complex that we can visualize with our best methods currently. Yeah, and imagine you're 18-year-old college freshman, and you have all these ideas how to fix society. Yeah, perfect. That's
right. Exactly.
Totally makes sense.
Well, there's something about being youthful that makes you feel like you can change the world in a positive way, and it's mostly just because you haven't come in contact with enough of the complex factors that make up the fabric of society to understand that at an individual level, you really lack efficacy. We work much better when we cooperate.
Oh, definitely. So that's the first thing. You lack knowledge. So you think that the knowledge which you have is sufficient, and that's pretty small. So you haven't been exposed to the complexity. And the second thing, I really thought why. So think about that. If you're an adolescent, if you're a teenager, so 100,000 years ago, you become rebellious. You want autonomy.
Right.
Is there a drive to run away from your parents in order to, expand the tribe to new territories? That's just a hypothesis.
Well, it seems synonymous with every movie that's ever been made. The first thing that the person does is they go off and cause some trouble, and they have to get away from the place that they're familiar with,
Yes.
I could talk about archetypes all day, but we'll try to keep it strictly in the realm of the psychological, although I do feel like archetypes are embedded in the realm of the psychology. They're fully ensconced in there. Are you familiar with Jung and his work on archetypes? And
yes.
What can you give me some examples of archetypes that you have studied in your time in your studies?
I can tell you my archetype. So my archetype is probably the child archetype.
Okay.
That's
the man-child?
Probably not. So I'm not familiar with that. The child in terms of raw curiosity for its own sake. Curiosity without an agenda. So
just human beings are probably the most curious creatures that live on this planet. Would you agree with that statement?
I haven't had a cat.
That's the thing. They always say that cats are the curious ones. I think we're the curious ones.
Maybe primates, chimps also fix their attention when they see something interesting, and mostly the interesting things are also the dangerous ones, like
snakes. Yeah. If you put a snake in a room with chimpanzees, they'll just stare at it for 10 hours?
Once I put a fake snake behind my grandma's cat. No, the cat freaked out.
Yeah. They don't like it. It's that's another thing I try to explain to people is that, and this can kind of tie in with I'm really big on exercise and diet because so much of our psyche is predicated around these ancient systems.
Okay.
And I noticed that if I try to go my day without eating food, I'm a little bit more anxious. And I think the reason why that is because my mind is, thinking, hey, why are you trying to go out do all these other things? My primary concern is to know if I'm going to have a good meal today. And until I know for sure that that meal is available, I'm not going to give you the full clarity that you normally have.
Oh, definitely. That's your foundation. If
Right.
you lack that, you can build upon it.
Well, that's psychoanalytic, right? Is the idea that we're made up of a bunch of different personalities that are struggling for dominance.
It's also physiological. If, a huge percentage of homicides occur because someone was hungry or in hypoglycemia. So that's really interesting. You may notice a pattern, by the way. Carbohydrates, even the slowest ones, can give you energy for like 4 hours tops. After 4 hours, you run out of energy. You need to eat again.
Right.
Otherwise, you go into emergency mode. Cortisol is being released in order to get some sugar in your bloodstream, whatever. That makes you aggressive. Obviously, you need that aggression, to kill, to hunt, to acquire food. We're thinking in
interesting. I never thought of that. No one's ever explained that to me. That's very interesting.
You'll notice a pattern. So go to like a family gathering, whatever. People will eat fast carbohydrates, which your blood sugar skyrockets and then rapidly drops after an hour. Suddenly, you aren't prepared, and then a lot of stress hormones are released, making you very aggressive, in order to counteract that sugar drop. You'll notice that people will start fighting and arguing after an hour or 4 hours max.
So what you're saying is don't blame it on your family, blame it on the carbohydrates.
That they definitely contribute. This is a reason why I experimented with the ketogenic diet some years ago, and I'm still sticking to that. Yes, definitely.
That's funny because, I'm actually a recovering vegan. I was a vegan for 2 years, and I'm no longer living that lifestyle because what kind of happened is I realized I was spending a lot of time in the kitchen. I was having to eat a lot more, bigger meals and more consistently throughout the day. And I just felt like that was taking away from, time for other things. But there's some utility about the ketogenic diet, right? Because ketones are a primary factor in our energy.
Yeah, we have two energy currencies, glucose and ketones, so when you burn fat, you use the ketones.
Now, can I ask you one question? This is something that I've had a conversation with a couple other nutritionists and dietitians and stuff like that. I have a friend who's on keto, but he eats a lot of fast food, but he'll get rid of the bun. And my argument to him is that he's actually not doing keto, he's doing low carb, because if you eat meat that was grain fed, you're getting the secondhand carbohydrates that animal ate. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I've never researched that, by the way.
If you only give a cow, corn grain, and then you eat a steak, you're not actually getting that same volume of fat and protein. You're actually getting a certain amount of corn grain that's secondhand from the cow's diet.
Well, I've never heard about that. However, even corn-fed animals, so at least the meat which I buy, the muscle meat itself will contain very little carbohydrates. So some other parts of the animal may accumulate more, hypothetically, but I doubt that there would be that much of a difference. The carnivore diet advocate, the big guy, Dr. Sean Baker, he had in some of his videos, he discusses the difference between grass-fed beef and everything else, fed beef and
soy, corn, vegetarian.
Yeah, the difference isn't that big in terms of...
It's not. Okay, well, that's good to know. Yeah, I'm no expert when it comes to diet, by any means. So I'm not making any recommendations or anything like that. I want to make that clear.
Nobody is. Nobody is. The science there is a mess.
It seems like it's impossible to quantify, not only because we all have different heritage, but I think about this, yeah, you can have someone eat a steak and then you can test all their levels and stuff, but are you taking into account all the other foods that they've eaten and how the steak is interacting with those foods? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, epidemiological studies aren't really good in finding out what happens in terms of diet, unless you find like a 300% difference between the two groups.
Right.
It's doubtful that you found something interesting. That
Well, that
isn't
was the
just
point.
chance.
That was what separated me from veganism. Is somebody explained to me that there's never been a multi-generational study of that diet. There's never been 5 generations of people who lived on the vegan diet. So we really just have no idea if it's healthy.
Well, the problem there is the definition of healthy. So again, hundreds or so, 1,000 years ago, you have people in the north, which the only thing which they could eat is mammoth, mammoth, subcutaneous fat and muscle meat.
Right.
There weren't that many plants around, and also glucose plants which are high in glucose weren't abundant before we started growing them and before we started selecting them. So our metabolism is adopted to survive on meat and fat alone. On the other hand, in the south, where more plants were abundant, you had people who were eating plants in larger quantities. Now, then we mix. And you have something called crossover in terms of when the sperm and the egg, when they combine, when the new human is being determined at that point of conception, genes mix and chromosomes mix and genes mix. So it means that after thousands of years of mixing, you have no idea what specific foods would be beneficial for you and what may be a trigger.
At that point, is it up to you on an individual level to kind of go and figure out what diet is optimal for you by doing a kind of test and trial process?
So again, this is Jordan Peterson's daughter, Michaela Peterson. You start with eating only meat for a month. Mm-hmm. If you have a problem, if you feel well, don't do anything. You're good to go. If you don't feel well, if you have a certain health issue or whatever, depression, anxiety, any chronic condition that may be linked to food.
I think that what you said there, most people don't really get that. The idea that something that's happening cognitively can be affected by diet. I feel like people only attribute their physical ailments to their diet, whereas we really need to instantiate the idea in people's mind that it's totally can affect your cognitive ability as well.
I can tell you a possible link, a possible important link, how diet can contribute to changing your cognitive abilities. And that's actually linked with the research I'm doing as part of my PhD. So check it out. Let's say that your grandparents never ate avocado. Let's say, they never ate avocado. No one from your ancestors ate avocado.
I just ate an avocado before this podcast. I just want to say that.
I have some bad news for you. You sit down, please.
Yeah, okay.
Check
I'm
it
ready.
out. So you eat the avocado, and your immune system will recognize it as some foreign substance, and your immune system will react to the avocado in many possible ways. So I won't go into details. The thing is that certain molecules which your immune system cells use to talk with each other can reach your brain and activate the resident immune cells in the brain, which we call microglia. So those are special cells which are, I call them the Swiss Army knives of the brain, because they can do anything. They are repairmen, they are soldiers that fight infections, they constantly change the connections of your brain. So you learn something and then the microglial cells grow there and start changing synaptic connections, whatever. Right. But when they get triggered by an immunological response, they can wreak a lot of havoc, because a microglial cell will chase a mouse with a nuclear warhead, and they may cause far more damage than useful. So the link is, you trigger the immune system in the gut, those molecules reach your brain, activate your microglia, and microglia changes the wiring in your brain, which may lead to changes in your cognitive functions, personality, anxiety, depression, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I never really thought about it like that. I do notice that for sure when I eat a meal of high protein and high fat, I don't have to eat as soon as I would if I eat a heavy carbohydrate meal. And I think that that's kind of touching on what you're saying. One last question I have for you before we kind of wrap things up. Who's your favorite psychologist and why?
Oh, you're asking a person who is high in openness to pinpoint one thing. That would be difficult.
That might be difficult.
Yeah, I would say Jordan Peterson because
Really?
yeah, really, because like he opens me up to. I was unknowingly an ideologue regarding certain topics.
Interesting.
And
We could talk about that for a little bit.
okay, yeah, no problem. And he's not his teachings, but the information which he shared, you know,
Right.
not his opinion.
A lot of what Jordan Peterson does is relay information that other psychologists have laid the groundwork for.
Yeah, we are all borrowing the works from our ancestors. So
right, exactly.
Even the shoes which we are wearing at the moment, you know, that's generations of experience in order to produce the shoes. Whatever. So the information which he shared and his own insights, his connections between the disciplines, that really showed me that I was wrong about certain really important topics.
Can you give me an example of one of those topics if you feel comfortable?
Yeah, of course. One of those topics was religion. So until Jordan Peterson, I was like a new atheist, you know, hardcore Richard Dawkins.
Right. And Sam Harris.
Yeah, it isn't obvious. How obvious it is. If religion was that stupid, then why would a huge percentage of humanity use it, including really intelligent and rational people? So that isn't so obvious. And Jordan Peterson opened me up to the evolutionary psychology of religion,
right.
to the biology that led to religion, and even to the utility of religion. You know, of course, there are some drawbacks in the 21st century, and we've been talking about them a lot. But
right. Well, one of those drawbacks is the idea is, you know, I mean, well, it's a drawback and it's a positive. It's great that we have, you know, science readily available for us and that we're more scientifically minded. What I think that does, though, is one of the side effects is that we look at something like the Bible and we want it to be objectively true, when that's not the case that was being made when it was written. The case that was being made was that there's an underlying message in these stories, and it's up for us to extrapolate that out and then learn how to apply it in our own life.
Yeah, that Jordan Peterson pretty much expands upon that in many hours of lectures. You know?
And what do you think about the idea that societies who abandon the idea of God don't tend to do very well?
Tend to do or don't tend to do?
They tend not to do very well.
I've heard about that. I've been planning to research that, and let's link that with our previous discussion on how knowing the truth may be at your disadvantage compared to being deceived. However, in the 21st century, our world now is really complex. We can't use meta memes and heuristics which religion provides. And also the world is globalized and people mixed a lot, and religion may work in societies which are pretty homogeneous. You know, people then tend to have the same values. Now we may need a way to organize our behavior and address the complexity of the world, and this is where we need science and objectivity.
Right. Well, and that's another thing too that Jordan Peterson often points out, is that sometimes a good story is truer than the truth because it takes aspects of different truths that we accept as inherently true and amalgamates them into a story that's digestible. So you're actually receiving a hyper volume of information in a story that seems, you know, condensed and like I said, digestible.
Oh yeah, definitely. The problem with the interpretation of that is, again, he opened the door. Why? You can interpret that in so many ways. So you need, again, a stable, consistent way to interpret those allegorical stories as well.
Do you think it's pretty normal for people to go through a phase where they're, more likely to see the utility in atheism? Because it seems like most of the people who I know who are intelligent religious thinkers were once atheistic. Like I was once atheistic. Jordan Peterson was once atheistic. Now you're telling me you were that way as well. Do you think that's a pretty normal stage in development to kind of abandon the idea of God and then maybe return to it?
I've seen other intelligent thinkers do that. Can't say whether that's a principle. Well, it's important to define what we mean by atheistic. It's if you believe in a man in the sky, that watches you masturbate and judging you.
Right.
Maybe empirically that is still not the case. However, if you believe that the way the human brain organizes values and behavior within a population in a useful way that is empirically wrong, but has worked for many thousands of years, then yes, However, that still doesn't address the problem with, in order for religion to work, you really need to believe that all these things are empirically correct, and science has undermined that. And now you can't believe them, and then you lose the benefits. And now we have the current age of meaninglessness, which John Vervaeke, he's a colleague of Jordan Peterson. I really love his work. Now he's addressing that. John Vervaeke.
I'll have to ask you about it after the podcast. I'll look into it for sure. And that seems to be the postmodern critique, right? Is that there's an unlimited number of interpretations in the Bible, and therefore, how can you determine which interpretation is more effective than the others?
That's a really good criticism. The way Jordan Peterson tries to address the point is to link the stories to mythology and archetypes, which are linked to evolutionary psychology. So again, we go back to evolutionary psychology because evolutionary psychology is falsifiable, is predictive. The theories of the hypotheses of evolutionary psychology can be tested. And the idea is, evolution shaped our behavior, that shaped our myths, and religion is a meta-myth, like the distillate of all those myths. That's the framework. Whether it works, I don't know. That's just food for thought.
Well, I learned a whole lot just having you on this podcast. I hope that you're willing to come back someday. You're obviously very brilliant and very educated and well-read. So this is really why I do this, is I like to have conversations with people who can teach me things, and you've already taught me so many things. So thank you for coming on. I do just want to say that there is a PayPal option as well as my website below. So if you want to get exclusive content, feel free to check out the website. But thanks for coming on, man. I really appreciate it. This is the Daily Discussion, and everybody have a great day.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
It has been an honor.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.